All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Conservancy's Grantee onboarding training. We can start off with a round of introductions of the Coastal Conservancy staff leading the training today. And I can go first. I'm Jessica Madden. I'm a California State Sea Grant Fellow working in the Central Coast region of the Conservancy. And I'll pass it off to Mary.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Small. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer at the Conservancy. I'll pass it to Rodrigo.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rodrigo Garcia, and I'm a project manager in the South Coast region. Linda.
Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Tong, project manager in the San Francisco Bay Area region. And Michael.
Hey, everybody. I'm Michael Bowen. I'm project manager in the North Coast region. Back to Jessica.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, so congratulations on receiving a grant from the Conservancy. We just want to thank you for the work that you do and say that we're very excited to help fund your project. Before we start, I want to highlight our grantee manual, which you can find on the Coastal Conservancy website. This, along with your project manager, will be your best resource for everything we're going to talk about today. We have a ton of material to cover in this hour, so this will be a broad overview to introduce you to our processes and terminology. But please look at this grantee manual or ask your project manager. Uh-oh.
We can see and hear you, Jess.
Can? Okay, my entire computer went black. So sorry. Thank you. I'll continue then. I can't see you, but I'm going to continue. So like I said, please take a look at this grantee manual or ask your project manager if you need more information. And we will share these slides and this recording with you after the training. We'll post it to our Coastal Conservancy website. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rodrigo.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. So this graph on your screen outlines the steps and the workflow of a Coastal Conservancy grant. During the presentation, we're going to go over each step to get you started on your work, your grant agreement, and everything that encompasses the lifetime of your grant. And after each section, we're going to have a small segment for questions related to that, to the segment that we just covered. But please feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. If any questions arises as any of us speak, please type them in and we will try to answer them as we go, or we will answer them at the end of that section. In the interest of time, we want to make sure we use both options. Next slide, please. Great. So this is going to be the very first step of your project after approval of your project from our board. The first step is to go into a grant agreement. Your SEC project manager is going to begin drafting a grant agreement. They probably already started. And this grant agreement is what memorializes the terms and conditions of your grant. It is a legally binding contract between both organizations. So it's really, really important that you read it carefully before you sign it, as any changes would need an amendment. And there are going to be a few things in it that you want to make sure that you are very well aware of through the lifetime of your project. A couple of things for us to get this grant agreement produced is going to be a pay data record form. Your project manager is going to send you this form for you to fill out and sign. This form is what tells us your organization's information for where you want to get paid. So it's very important that you take care of that very quickly. And it'll be sent to you via DocuSign. So please make sure you either check in with your project manager or they will send it to you at the point that they need it. Another really important thing to keep in mind is that the grant agreement will have 3 very important dates. The very first date is the work completion date. This date is when you need to complete all work by, when the project needs to be completed. This is important because no work performed after this date can be reimbursed for. And this is a date that you can negotiate with your project manager. You probably thought about it as you were writing your proposal. So you probably have some idea of when this will be, but obviously with the timeline of when your project got approved and when your grant agreement is drafted, this might need to change. So as always, communicate with your project manager and we can find a work completion date that works for all parties. The other important date to keep in mind is that final request for disbursement date. This is going to be the date that you need to submit your final invoice by. It usually is a month after your work completion date. But this one is also important because it is the time that gives us enough time for us to process that final invoice, make sure that your project was completed successfully, that you have submitted all your required materials, and we can go ahead and close out your project. The last date is the grant termination date, and this is the day that your grant legally expires, and it usually is 3 months after that final request for disbursement date. Your grant agreement is going to be a 5-digit number, and whenever you communicate with us, it's important that you use that grant agreement number so that we can easily identify which grant agreement you're talking about as we work with many different organizations. So keep an eye on that one and reference it back anytime you need to reach out to us. Any questions on grant agreements? Cool. We can go to the next slide. All right. The next step is going to be conditions precedent. This happens right after our grant agreement is drafted and signed, and these are going to be listed on your grant agreement. So next slide, please. The conditions precedent, as I mentioned, these are listed in your grant agreement, and these need to be completed and successfully approved before you can start any work on your project. So it's important that you pay attention to this section and communicate with your project manager as to whether you have successfully met all the requirements of this portion. These are the standard ones that you will see for most projects. There might be 1 or 2 different ones depending on the nature of your project, but for the most part, this is what you'll see. First, you will find a grantee board resolution. This is the form that tells us that your organization has received this grant, that is aware and that you as the project manager of that organization is allowed to negotiate this with us, that you're allowed to sign on behalf of your organization. We do have a form for it, but if your organization already has their own, you can go ahead and use that for yourself. Next slide, please. I believe that's proof of insurance, right? Okay, yeah, so this is the board resolution. This is what our form looks like. As I mentioned, it authorizes a designated person to act as a representative of the grantee. We have a form available in the grantee manual that Jessica mentioned earlier, but you can use your own. Next slide, please. The next condition precedent is proof of insurance. Typically, we require $2 million in liability, but this can be different depending on the nature of your project, and your grant agreement will outline those limits required necessary to what your project is. One important point to note on your proof of insurance is that the Coastal Conservancy does need to be named as additional insured. And on a certificate of liability, it typically looks as that red box shows on the screen. You can chat with your insurance holder, and they should be familiar with what you mean when you say that you want to list us as additional insured. But that's pretty important that you make sure you take care of that. Next slide, please. There's no slide for this, but if your project requires it, we are going to need proof of permits or that you are allowed to perform the project, whether it's a landowner agreement, if you're going to be doing any work on someone else's land, or any permits from city, county, or state agencies that are necessary for your work. These might seem like a lot, but again, your project manager is going to be working with you through the drafting of that grant agreement and through the submission of those conditions precedent to make sure that all of them are submitted. The next step is going to be the work program, and I'm going to pass that on to Linda. Oh, before we move on to the work program, is there any questions on those conditions precedent that I mentioned? If there are, just feel free to unmute yourself and chime in.
I do have one question about auto insurance.
Go ahead.
Our organization is fully remote, and so it's our policy that on any travel over 45 miles, staff will rent cars. Our liability insurance provides insurance coverage for those cars. Does that meet the insurance requirement?
It should.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. If there are no other questions, I'm going to pass it on to Linda. Again, if you think of any other questions as we speak, feel free to just type them in the Q&A portion at the bottom, and we'll answer them as we go.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Thank you. Well, we are going to go into our next step, which is the work program. You may also know this as a work plan or a scope of work. And this is part of the conditions precedent to disbursement that's listed in your grant agreement. Next slide, please. The work program is a very important roadmap for what you'll be accomplishing with your grant. It details specific tasks, deliverables, the project schedule, and a task level budget for your funded project. I also want to mention briefly that Rodrigo also said that, depending on what type of grant you have, some of these conditions precedent may be different. So for an acquisition project, you actually will not be having a work program. But for most grants, for planning, implementation, construction, you will have a work program. This work program is important when you're billing to the Conservancy grant. You'll be using all the tasks and the task level budget in the invoices. And while the grant agreement can only be changed through a formal amendment, the work program is more of a living document and can be revised more easily. So you can work with your Conservancy project manager to make sure the work program reflects the current budget between different tasks and the schedule for the project. Next slide, please. At the top of the work program, it'll ask you for a project description. Please keep this to a concise high-level summary of your project that states the goals of your project and what will be done to achieve them. Your Conservancy project manager may use the description from the grant agreement or staff recommendation to keep it concise and consistent with the legally binding document. And we ask that this section be kept to one paragraph or so. Next slide, please. Next section is the scope of work section. This is where you'll describe your project in task form. We want a short narrative description that contains important details for each task, such as what you'll do, when you'll do it, where it'll happen. So the narrative contains outcomes, and the task deliverables will be the work products produced through the task. For example, if your task is to develop a conceptual plan for a restoration project with community input, some suitable deliverables might be a document and graphic of the conceptual plan, and a memo summarizing the community engagement process. And you can see on the screen here, there's subtasks under each task. You can use that as a way to provide more narrative, but the task deliverables are for the task in general, the overall task. Next slide, please. Thank you. The slide is a little busy, but I think it would be a good reference for if you need to review the slides later on. The next section is the schedule, and on the screen shows 2 examples of different schedules. This is where your scope of work is detailed in a table format. So it contains the task names, it lists out the deliverables in bullet form, and then it also shows when the estimated completion date for each task will be. And this is a really good way to quickly get a snapshot of how far along you are in progress of your project. And if you need to make amendments to your work program, it's good to make sure you're updating the schedule in this section of the work program as well. And I will also mention that within the work program, there's flexibility, of course, as a grantee for how you want to format your different tasks and what bins you'll want to put different activities in for each task. What works best is if we keep the schedule or if we keep the budget and schedule concise and simple. This allows for easier billing on our end. Next slide, please. This is a sample budget. Again, we like to keep it simple so that when it goes to our contracts and accounting staff, it is easier for invoicing and billing. The tasks in the budget should match the tasks that you listed out in the previous section schedule, which details your scope of work in table format. And next slide, please. The next section is the budget detail section, and here you'll list direct costs, travel costs, and indirect costs in your budget. All organizations that receive funding from the Conservancy need to meet strict accounting standards. So there is always a possibility of an audit for a project in the future. So it is a responsibility of our grantees to use generally accepted accounting principles that are published by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. Direct costs are the specific expenses that's related to your project, and they would include labor costs, some project-specific materials and equipment, and subcontractors. Within the work program, you don't need to tell us hourly rates or number of hours worked for each person working on the project, but keep in mind that when you invoice, you will need to provide that information. For materials and equipment, you can list out, types of materials that you'll need to purchase for the project purposes. And if you will be purchasing equipment that lasts longer than the length of the grant, we'll need some special language stating that such equipment will be retained by you, the grantee, for project purposes. And there'll be some language in that within the work program template. Next slide, please. We also allow for indirect costs, and this is also known as overhead. That includes rent, utility bills, general purpose equipment, and we allow you to bill up to 20% of your grant total as indirect cost, but be sure you can justify your indirect cost rate and keep detailed records of your expenses in case of an audit. Next slide, please. And we also ask you to list out subcontractors that you'll be using for the grant. These are entities that the main grantee organization hires on to help with the project. And we just ask for the name, qualifications, and a brief scope of work for each subcontractor. Next slide, please. And lastly, we have a section on a plan for acknowledgement of the Coastal Conservancy. We like to be acknowledged in physical acknowledgements such as signage and in communication materials that may be printed. This helps give us funding recognition to make sure that future funding is made available for our programs. This acknowledgement doesn't have to be in physical format. It could be done through social media posts or website announcements. And it's also fine if you just say in your plan that you may make a certain number of signs, and these signs will include Conservancy acknowledgement. You don't have to have a final mock-up within your work program. Next slide, please. And that is it for the work program. Can I see if there are any questions? I don't see any in the Q&A.
I have a quick question. Hi.
Yes, go ahead.
In terms of subcontractors, some of our planned subcontractors are kind of local storytellers, and we're going to put a call out for those storytellers. So we don't have all of their names yet. Is that something we would just negotiate with our program manager as we're developing that?
Yes, definitely. If you know the names of your subcontractors already, you can include them in the work program. Otherwise, the work program can be approved with some language saying that, future subcontractors can be approved by your project manager through email or, at a later stage. So you can, it's definitely possible. All right, if there are no more questions, I will move on to the next section, which is startup. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay, go ahead, no worries.
Regarding subcontractors, we're a federally recognized Indian tribe, and we're used to using like Davis-Bacon wages, when we use subcontractors and doing all that reporting. Is any of that going to be required for subcontractor work? It sounds like we just need names and scopes of work.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the reporting that you just mentioned. Is anyone else on the Conservancy team aware of that? Could you repeat that?
Is that prevailing wage reporting?
Yeah, so we'll have to do prevailing wage reporting, and do we use California Department of Industrial Relations numbers, or as a federally recognized tribe, do we use the Department of Labor?
So prevailing wage is triggered for certain kinds of work that we may fund. This is probably a case-by-case answer because it's so complicated, the rules that govern it. So I would say talk to your project manager. There's certain kinds of work that we fund through our grants that may be subject to prevailing wage requirements. But hope, yeah. So I
Okay.
would just say case by case. Sorry,
Right.
that's not very satisfying, but.
No, that works. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary.
And Linda, I think we do have a few questions in the
Oh.
Q&A box. The first one is, do you have a database where we can get graphics or printable materials that we can access? I think for acknowledgement.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I'm not seeing my Q&A. Oh, okay, now I see it. Yes, we have the files for our for the Conservancy logo on our website, and we can provide a link to that.
And then our next one is regarding subcontractors. Do we need a DIR number?
Yeah, I think Mary just touched on that. It depends.
That makes sense. Okay, and then last one before we move on. Are participant or storyteller stipends considered subcontractors or materials and supplies?
It's a good question.
I think if they're being paid for a service, then they're subcontractors, because then presumably they have to report income.
Yeah.
Yes.
Though it's possible they could be part of the direct costs. Let us get back to you on that. I think we have some prior examples and we can get back to you. Right, I don't see any other questions. Yeah, and I'm seeing something in the chat. In the past, people have put stipends under the direct costs. Right, let's move on to the start work portion. Jess, do you mind advancing? Thank you. Once all the conditions precedent to disbursement have been approved, your Conservancy project manager will be sending you an approval letter. And this is your notice to proceed on with your project. When you get this letter, you can begin work that will be billed to the grant. And on the page, it's just an example what that letter might look like. Next slide, please. Are there any questions on that?
Yeah, it looks like we have one in the Q&A. I can read it out from Mark Green. What if you are convening stakeholders and providing stipends to ensure all can afford to participate? Those are stipends, not subcontractors, right?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the past, some projects have put stipends as a direct cost, but we can look up some examples and maybe we can share that as a resource with folks. All right, thanks, Jess. Let's pass it on to Michael for the next section.
Okay, thank you, Linda. And thanks everybody for joining. So you got your grant, you've received your approval letter, you filled out all the forms that you need to fill out, and you've started all of the wonderful work that you're doing. Now comes some more paperwork, but the really important paperwork for us for keeping track of your project and making sure that you get paid. Can you advance to the next slide, please? So Don't wait until the end of your project to start keeping track of it. Utilize your internal time and task management systems to keep track of your tasks. Adhere to your work program and the tasks defined there. And please try to stay in close contact with your project manager for guidance as questions arise, and just to keep them informed about the project that you're working on. Next slide, please. Really important to submit invoices routinely. Don't wait for work to pile up and then submit them all at once. Quarterly is ideal. No less than monthly. And you may not invoice for any work prior to the start date of the project. So an invoice is your progress report, your request for disbursement form, and the backup documentation that supports that request for disbursement form, or RFD. And these should all be combined into a single PDF and emailed to invoice or invoices at SCC. And CC your project manager so that they can review the progress report and the invoice as well. Next slide, please. So for the progress report, there is a template that you can use that will help you explain the progress of the project in relation to the tasks that you've identified. Update on progress, challenges that you've had, successes during the billing period. And please include pictures or indications of progress of the project as you proceed. Next slide. So this is the request for disbursement form. And on the left is page 1. This side of the form summarizes the expenses from the billing period. The task number, name, and budget must match your approved work program or work plan. So if your task 1 is project management, then the left side should say task 1, project management. Your task budget that's in the yellow column would indicate what the allotted amount or approved amount is for that task, and costs incurred during the period, how much has been spent to date, and then in the final yellow column, the remaining balance. You calculate and add the withholding of 5%, or in some cases 10%, which will then be returned with the final payment at closure of the project. Next slide, please. Page 2 of the request for disbursement breaks down the expenses that were listed on page 1. All expenses except labor require you to submit backup documentation, although you should still keep records of your labor costs that you're incurring during the project period in case of future audit. The backup documentation is the receipts and invoices that were showing that expenses have been paid. The percent of indirect costs must match the work program. If you have an approved indirect cost rate of 10%, that's what you can bill, and that's what should be reflected. Labor still requires backup, but as I mentioned, it's not submitted, but you can be audited, so you should keep it for your records. And then you can see at the bottom, subcontractor expenses would be listed there. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, missed the bullet points. There we go. So these are some examples of the backup documentation. Wait, is this the paid receipts? Yeah. A note on this Amazon.com receipt. It's a good example. If you're ordering things or supplies for the project, the receipt should show that the item was actually shipped, showing a proof of delivery. Bank statements are not accepted as receipts. Save all of your receipts. And next slide, please. Travel costs. So for car travel, there's either a personal vehicle mileage reimbursement rate with travel record. For the current year, July 23 to June 24, that's 65 cents or 65.5 cents per mile. Or alternatively, you can submit gas receipts and with a rental car receipt if that's applicable. And the sort of sample sample travel form is shown at the bottom. And then we can also pay parking fees and tolls that are incurred during the course of the project. Next slide, please. So subcontractors, as we were mentioning earlier, are other people or organizations that you pay to complete a service for you and provide their invoices as backup. Examples be cultural resource specialist, community engagement specialist, engineers, and so forth. The subcontractor invoices must include a description of the work completed and how much it cost. Next slide, please. Maybe this would be a good opportunity to take questions on this section for anyone Q&A.
Yeah, I can read you. We got a couple in the Q&A box. First one is, what is the difference between a stipend and an honorarium?
Ooh, that's a good one. I don't know if I've ever administered a project with an honorarium.
I don't think that we treat them differently. I mean, if it's a cash payment for something that for participating in a project, I think we'd put it sort of under. If you could call it stipends, it will fit in our little boxes.
Okay, yeah, I asked that question because in the work plan template, they are called out in two different places. A stipend falls under a stipend falls under direct cost, and an honorarium is specified under subcontracts. So we
do call them something different. We will look into it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thanks, Mary. No problem. I'm happy to make them stipends. That's totally fine.
Melissa, you're hired.
Okay, and then we have one more question in the Q&A. The IRS mileage reimbursement rate increased to 67 cents per mile as of January 1st, 2024. Are we able to use this rate as that's what we reimburse our staff?
Is that a state rate or a federal rate that you're referring to? We use the approved state rate.
Yeah, I think she was referring to the IRS mileage reimbursement rate. And so I think we use the state mileage reimbursement, so there might be some discrepancy there. And then we have one more question. How do the progress reports and invoicing differ for acquisition projects?
Great question. So first of all, stepping back to an earlier part of the presentation, your grant agreement for an acquisition will be very different than, say, for a planning project. And the manner in which you request funds for disbursement will also be different as will the payment. That might be, I don't know. Mary, should that be a question to take up with the project?
Well, I mean, just
Manager?
fundamentally, if you're doing an acquisition, we're gonna send the money into escrow. And so the whole invoicing is gonna look different, but it's a lot. The good news is it's a lot simpler because generally it's one request for funding that's done through escrow instructions.
And yeah, and perhaps another important distinction is for most of our projects and under most of our grant agreements, our payments are in arrears. So you incur the expense, you do the work, and then you bill us, and then we reimburse. Whereas an acquisition is a payment into escrow, as Mary mentioned, so completion to acquisition. Okay, any other questions before we move on to?
I did have one question about the invoice. Are we going to be reusing the same invoice each quarter and just transposing the numbers, or are we creating a new one each quarter?
So you will use the same form.
Okay.
But of course, as you go from invoice number 1 to invoice number 2, the running balances will change.
Right.
Unless you amend your scope of work, of course, your task budgets won't change.
Okay.
But the next columns will, how much you're billing, how much you've drawn down, and what the final balance is in that final column.
Okay. And then as far as invoicing numbers, is that something that you give us or something that we create on our own?
You can create on your own, and you can use them. You may have your own internal reporting or recording system, and so you're welcome to use your own system. As long as the ones we see are different each time.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Project completion. I'm sorry, are there any other questions before we move on? All right. Project completion. Next slide.
Oops. Sorry. There we go.
Okay, great. So, you've kept in touch with your project manager and hopefully kept them involved so they're aware of where the project is at, the stage of it, and you will have submitted all of your deliverables. Maybe that's a final report. Maybe that's a new acquisition. Maybe it's explore the coast. Could be any number of things or events that constitute your final deliverables, and those will be identified in your grant agreement. But ultimately, all of you are doing the wonderful work that the Conservancy loves to support, and so please include us, invite us to site visits, community events, public events, and press conferences, and if we can help share the good word about the great work that you're doing, we're certainly there and really happy to help do that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. It might have been the one prior to this, or yeah. So you will, once you do submit all of your deliverables, need to submit a final request for disbursement. And this is where you're able to request that final withholding. And again, can you go back, please?
Sorry about that. It has mind of its own right now.
And so this, what you submit will look very much like the other requests. Thanks. That's perfect. But you will check the box at the bottom, indicating that this is your final invoice and that you're closing out the project and requesting final payment. And then that final withholding will be released, and you'll receive a project completion letter from your project manager. And then you're done. One thing this I didn't see in the presentation that probably should be noted is oftentimes if it's a if it's a capital improvement project, there's a 20-year term on the grant typically, and so there may be future site visits or things like that to review the status of the project. And I believe that is it. Final slide. And pass it back to
me, I think.
Back to you. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you all for listening, and thanks again for all the work that you do. At this time, we have about 11 minutes left, so we welcome any questions. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, or you can feel free to just raise your hand or use the chat. We'd love to hear questions about any of the topics we discussed, or if there's anything we didn't cover today that you would like answers to. Okay, it looks like we do have one in the Q&A. So I'll pose it to the rest of the SCC staff here with us. Question from earlier, which is the date after which no funds can be spent?
I can answer. That's gonna be the project completion date. The project completion date is when all work must be done by. And as I mentioned, that can be negotiated with your project manager depending on when you start your project, but any work past that point cannot be reimbursed for.
Great, thanks, Rodrigo. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Elisa.
Hi. So I'm kind of restructuring our grants process, and I'm new at my organization. And I'm kind of just curious what people use for managing grants as far as software or tools. And I'm curious if anybody on here, someone mentioned in the chat, I think it was Josh, he uses Rake. I'm just curious if anyone has any suggested resources or tools, management systems that they love as they manage grants.
Yeah, that's a great question. If anyone else uses any systems that's worked with us before, feel free to type them in the chat.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do want to circle back to a question we had earlier about mileage rates. I just got confirmation that our mileage rate, which is tied to the state rate, is also tied to the IRS and has also increased to the 0.67 cents per mile. So it should be consistent across your reimbursement rates that you use.
I also want to note that it was pointed out in the chat as well, but the latest work program template that is downloaded from our website, under budget detail, it does split out materials mileage. And there's a separate section for staff time labor where I believe stipends can go. And then there's the indirect costs. That's the third section under budget detail.
I'm also curious if there is any email list that we can get on for new RFPs or grant opportunities
I can
Definitely. Are you getting the link?
Yeah, I'll post it in the chat for everyone. This is right, the link to our website where you can sign up for our email list, and we send out all information related to us. I think we should note that this is obviously a lot of information, and we're very well aware that nothing is simple with the state, but your project manager is a resource. And this is our job, so feel free to ask us. Email your project manager with any questions, and email them early, because there are things that do take some time to process. So as soon as you envision you're facing an obstacle, you're gonna need more time, you're gonna probably need more money, you need to change something in your work program, email your project manager, and we're here to help. We're here to figure out, and we want to see your project succeed. But if we don't know there's an issue, we can't really help you out. So if you have any questions, are frustrated with the process, don't understand the process, just email us and we're happy to help.
You mentioning the process, I've been a part of a few processes, and the SCC actually has been one of my easier ones. So give yourself a little credit. You guys have been seriously, the grant application process for you guys was way easier than the NOAA's Sultan Kennedy grant. So I appreciate the simplicity, actually. That might sound crazy to some people in here, but I've done a few, and no, it's been a pleasure working with you guys so far. So I'm looking forward to the future of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. That's great to hear.
I think it's fair to say that the state may be a little complicated, but the feds, that's complicated.
Well, they've been practicing longer.
I do have one question. When will we find out who our project manager is, or is that the person that we've already been working directly with?
It should be the person that you have been working directly with that brought your project to our board. If that changes for any reason, they'll be reaching out to you and introducing you to your new project manager.
Thank you.
Rodrigo, one thing, if I could, one thing that wasn't mentioned also in the presentation that I think is worthwhile for new grantees to know is change is constant and things always come up during the course of the project. If there's a need to amend your scope or budget, don't hesitate to reach out to your project manager to explore that. It's a fairly simple process and easily done, but another good reason to sort of stay in contact and keep communication. And then changes within tasks, I believe up to 5% can take place without an amended scope and budget. And then if they're beyond that, then you need to amend the scope and budget. But just for billing purposes, it's good to know that. So there's some built-in sort of flexibility and ease of use in both of those.
I think it's 10%, right, Michael?
Is it 10%? Oh, okay, thanks.
And we did get a question in the Q&A. Will this webinar be emailed out? I'm happy to, once we upload the recording to the website, I'm happy to send out an email with a link directly to where we will be storing this webinar's recording. And that way you can come back and re-listen, or if you weren't able to join today, you can review it that way. But like we said at the beginning, the resources for grantees website on our Coastal Conservancy web page, that is a great resource. It has a link to our grantee manual and all the forms you'll need, and it'll have a link to this recording. Looks like we just have a few minutes left. So if there's any last burning questions, please feel free to raise your hand or speak up.
Well, if nobody's got anything to say, I want to say thank you to Joel, who was just speaking. He was a huge help in me getting my grant. So thank you, Joel.
You're welcome.
You rock, brother.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us today and taking the time to listen to all of our processes and hopefully streamline this process. But like Rodrigo said, just don't hesitate to reach out with any questions and use your project manager as a resource.
I can testify to that. I bug Joel and Peter all the time.
Thanks, Jess, for facilitating.
My pleasure. Okay, well, I guess if that's it, have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.